In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at the basics of S3 and what are we going to do with S3? What service or what utility does S3 actually provide to us? So before we get started, what I want to do is I want to look at the costs that are going to be associated with S3 and kind of give you a brief description of what S3 is. So in its simplest form, I like to think of S3 as a directory that's sitting in the cloud that's accessible over the internet. And we have some control over that directory, meaning we don't have to make the directory writable, so we don't necessarily open it up so that users can save files to that directory, but we could. But for the most part, really what we're doing is we're creating a read-only file system directory that's sitting in the cloud. Okay, so that's kind of its simplest utility. If I go over to this next tab, it kind of walks you through the different types of costs that are associated with S3. So S3 does have some cost, and the way they charge you is you'll see across these tabs that there's different types of costs associated with S3. So there's costs for storing your data, so your files and things like that you store in S3. There's costs for retrieving that data. There's costs for transferring it, managing it, and replicating it. Okay. So there's storage costs. So you'll notice that it's a little over 2 cents per gigabyte for the first 50 terabytes of data. The next 450 terabytes up to 500 is going to be a little bit cheaper, and then over 500 terabytes is going to be even cheaper yet. Okay, and then you'll notice that there's different costs for storage, and what this is basically S3 allows you to configure the storage class that's associated with your resources that you're storing in your directory. And what you can do is you can say, well, you know, this is maybe a backup that I'm never going to have to access. And the example I like to think of is like an accounting firm that needs to keep 7 years of tax records. Well, I may never retrieve them, but I do need to store them. Okay, so I need to store them in case something goes wrong, but chances are I'm not going to need them if everything's on the up and up. So what I could do is I could say, well, you know, I really want just kind of infrequent access. And what that does is it allows me to pay less to store that data. Okay, so as long as I'm not accessing the data very often, I can get really cheap. For this class, though, we're going to be mostly looking at kind of standard storage. Okay, then we pay for requests. So these are based on the HTTP verbs. And you'll notice that the requests are fairly cheap. Per 1,000 requests, we're paying half a cent. And then if we're reading data, which is going to be most of our requests, it's even less than half a cent. Okay, and you'll notice that it goes way down. And this is by region. So for certain regions, I may end up paying more or less. So I'm looking at US East 2, which is Ohio. If I switch it to maybe a more expensive region, so Hong Kong might be more expensive. It doesn't look like it changed anything. Maybe if I go to Northern California, you'll notice it's a little bit more expensive. Not much, but it does change the price depending on which region we're talking about. And then there's costs for data transfer. So you'll notice anything that I upload to S3 is free. But then anything that my users would take out. So let's say I upload a video to S3, and then my users are streaming that video. I get to upload the video for free, so I put the content out there for free. But then the users that are actually accessing the video, I'm paying per gigabyte. So up to a gigabyte is free, but then it's going to be 9 cents per gigabyte per month, up to 10 terabytes. Okay, and again, I'm in California now, so that rate might change depending on what I'm looking at. Okay, and then management and analytics. So if I want to keep track of the inventory, basically what's going to happen is I can put kind of restrictions in place or kind of like a self-governing management policy in place so that I don't going back to my example, let's say I upload a video and it becomes a viral video and everyone's streaming it, I can limit access to that video after so long. So that's what this kind of management and analytics is. And then replication. What's happening with replication is, again, I'm going to go back to that example of me uploading a video. So if I upload a video to S3 and it becomes really popular, it might get streamed all over the world. And what's going to happen is I pay different data transfer rates depending on where I'm streaming it to. So what can happen is it might make sense for me, if it's streaming all over the world, that I actually replicate that video in multiple locations so that as users are trying to watch that video, they're watching it from their closest location. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview of the types of costs that you're going to incur with S3. For this class, so Cloud for Developers and as a developer, in its simplest terms, if we think about creating an HTML website that has some CSS and JavaScript, and host it within S3, so we put out a public directory and we're hosting a website, S3 is very, very affordable. So I know I hosted a React website, which is JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and it was 5,000 requests a month, and it was like 42 cents a month, I think, for about 6 months. So very cheap to store a website. The one thing I will say about S3 in terms of a website is I can't run any kind of server-side code. So you'll see this terminology of a static website, and the idea there is that your code does not execute on the server, meaning it has to execute on the client if you're going to create a website. So again, I keep going back to the fact that your website might be HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which would make it a static website. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview of the features of the S3 pricing structure. And what I want to do now is actually go into S3 and take a look at how those features are going to be implemented. Okay, so I have a couple of buckets. So I mentioned that think of S3 like a directory in the cloud. Each of these buckets are really directories. Okay, and I have a couple. So I have one for a domain, and then I have another one that was a demo. I'm going to go ahead and create a new bucket. Okay, and bucket names must be unique, must not contain spaces or uppercase letters, and there's rules for naming conventions. But really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make a unique name for my bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and call this Spring 2021 Cloud for Developers. And I'm picking a region where I actually want this located. And the idea here is that I may have a preference, I may not. So it kind of depends on where your end users are going to be. So if my end users are in Wisconsin, I think Ohio probably makes the most sense. But if my end users were on the West Coast, Oregon or California would make more sense. So I'm just picking Ohio. And then as I scroll down, one thing that you're going to want, so by default, public access for the bucket is blocked. And the idea there is that I don't want to incur charges as people are accessing the resources in my bucket until I'm comfortable with what I have set up. I can almost guarantee that you're not going to want to block all public access, at least when we're doing development, and especially if we're trying to push out a website. But we can always come back and change that later. But by default, our directory is not going to be accessible over the internet because we're blocking all public access. Okay, then we get into bucket versioning, and what versioning is basically as I'm making revisions to my website, I might want to see that revision history. And again, I might be using source code control to control versioning, but maybe I'm not, and maybe I just have version history set up within S3. Tags allow me to kind of say, this S3 resource is associated with this department or this project team, so that later when I look at the pricing or my billing statement, I could reconcile that bill to say, hey, this project generated this much of the bill. I can encrypt the files, and then you'll see I can lock a file. So write once, read many, that worm model basically is set up so that, maybe I want to put out like I don't know, a document that I don't want to get overwritten, and I don't have a good example at the top of my head, but I don't want the document overwritten, so I put out that maybe privacy policy, and it's out there for everyone to see. So I'm not changing anything, so the only thing I did is I decided what the name of my bucket was going to be, and it's going to fail because I do have uppercase letters in here, so I'm already failing the naming convention. So when I try to create the bucket, it's going to say, hey, bucket name must not contain uppercase letters. So I do want this name, so I will just use dashes here in place. And now I should have a reasonable name, and I can create that bucket. Okay, so now I have this Spring 2021 Cloud for Developers bucket, and objects are not public. And if I go into that bucket, I now have a couple of options that probably make sense. So I can upload files to that bucket. So if I go out to my desktop, I don't have too many files on there. I have a profile pic. Let me go ahead and create an HTML document. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new HTML document. So in the grammar, I'm going to change this to HTML. And I'm going to call this Cloud for Developers. And I'll have an H1 tag, Madison College, Cloud for Developers. And I'm going to go ahead and save that file on my desktop as index.html. And then I can upload that file. So I'm going to go ahead and upload that file. So I'm going to add the file. I'm just browsing to my desktop. There's the index.html file that I just created. And I'm going to go ahead and upload that file. Okay, so you'll notice that that file looks like it was successfully uploaded. And you can see I really have a directory, and this file's here. I should be able to click on it, and I get property information about that file. You'll notice that each object within that bucket has a storage class. So right now it's set up as that standard storage class. And when we were talking about pricing, we talked about how you could pay a lower cost if that was not frequently accessed. But for the most part, we're going to leave the storage class the same. The default storage class is usually fairly reasonable. And if I look at this object URL, what I really eventually want is if I open that link in a new tab, I'd like it to render out my HTML. It's an HTML page. I'd like it to render as HTML. And you'll notice that I'm getting an error saying access is denied. And there's a couple of issues that I have right now. The first is, if I go back to my bucket is not publicly accessible. So I have a permissions issue on my bucket, but then I also have another permissions issue on the file itself. Okay, so I have a couple of issues, and we'll deal with that here in a second. Okay, the next thing I want to do is for that file, I want to enable bucket versioning. Okay, so and it's actually on the bucket, not on the file. So I should have seen it here on the bucket under properties. That's usually where I'd enable bucket versioning. So I'm going to edit it. I'm going to enable it. So now I have bucket versioning enabled. And what that's going to do is if I go back over to Atom and I say, here's my updated file. Okay, so I made a change to that file. That's now my most recent version of the file. I should be able to go back to my bucket, and I can upload that file again. So I'm going to re-upload that file. Okay, so you'll notice that it succeeded. Now that file was uploaded again. And now if I click on that file, what's going to happen is, here's the content of the file, but you'll notice that I have this new tab called versions, and you'll see that I have two different versions. So the current version has a version ID, the old version does not have a version ID, and eventually that object URL with the version ID equal to null, once I get the permissions figured out, what'll happen is I'll see two different versions of this file. So I can kind of go back and forth and see the history of that file. But by default in the bucket, I'm just going to see kind of the latest and greatest version of that file. Okay. So next thing I want to do is I want to change S3. So I want to change this particular bucket so that it is publicly accessible. So I want users to be able to see this directory. It's eventually going to be a website, and I want people to see this HTML page. So I'm going to go in and change the permissions. And right now I'm blocking all public access. I need to edit that. I don't want to block public access. And it's going to say, are you sure that that's okay? And I am sure. I want to host a website. So, okay, so now you'll notice that I'm getting these warnings saying, hey, people can see the files that are in your bucket. And that's partially true. So my bucket has public access. But if I go over to the objects, and I look at index.html and I open that object URL, which is actually this, you'll notice I still get that same access denied error. And the reason I'm getting that access denied error is because this particular file, if I look at the permissions, you'll see that public access is not granted to anyone. Okay, so I could come through and change this access control list to say that everyone can read that file. I understand the effects, and I can add that grantee. Oops. Sorry, I just got to save the changes. Okay, so now what I did is that file is now public. So the bucket's public, the file's public, and now you'll notice that I'm able to see the file. It's getting rendered out as HTML. You'll notice that I have the updated version as well. Okay, so now I can see that file over the internet. If I were to build out a whole website, so each item in the website would have its own object URL, but the reality is I probably don't want to handle it that way. What I want to do is I want to say, this entire directory is a directory that's going to contain my website. So one of the things I can do with AWS S3 is if I go into the properties, one of the options if I scroll down is I can enable static web hosting. Okay, so this is what I was talking about with regards to having a website that contains HTML and JavaScript and CSS. I can push all of those things out to S3 and let S3 do the hosting. And static web hosting kind of is confusing when we first get started with this. But what we're really talking about is my code's not going to execute on S3. What ends up happening is I send my source code to the end user in their browser, like all websites work. So I send my code, my HTML, my JavaScript, my CSS, and then the code's actually executing inside their browser. So I'm restricted in that I can't execute Java code because I would need to run that server-side Java code through a Java virtual machine, and I'd have problems there, or PHP would cause problems, or Python would cause problems. So those server-side languages would cause problems, but JavaScript will not. Okay, so I'm going to enable static website hosting. Okay, so I'm hosting a static website, and then all it's going to ask for is, what's the default page for your website? So index.html is fine with me. And then what's the error document? So if the user tries to access a file in your website that doesn't exist, what page should get displayed? I'll make it error.html, even though I don't have that file in my bucket. And I'm going to go ahead and save the changes. Okay, and what's going to happen is if I look at static website hosting, you'll notice that now I have this URL for my website, and it's going to render my default page, which is index.html. That's the file that I uploaded. However, if I go to a page that's not there.html, you'll notice that what happens is I get access denied trying to retrieve a custom error document. And what's happening is I don't have that error.html file. Okay, so I set up the default document, which is index.html. And then I also set up the error document, so it tries to redirect me to that 403, which is forbidden error message. But I don't have that error document. So I'm going to go ahead and create the error document. So let me go ahead and say, here's a new file. I'll change the grammar to HTML again. Error. Something went wrong. H1. Oh no. Okay, this is my error document. And then I'm going to upload that file to S3. So I'm going back to my bucket. I'm going to go ahead and upload that file. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and upload it. And then if I look at that file, I need to change the permissions again. Okay, so right now you'll see everyone can't read that file. I'm going to go ahead and change that so that everyone can read that file. Oh, I got to click that I understand what I'm doing. Okay, and now that I've changed that, now you'll notice that when I try to go to this not there URL, what happens is it says, yeah, that's fine. You can go to notthere.html. But what I'm actually seeing is that error.html file. Okay, so that's going to allow me to host that static website. Okay, so S3 is a really cool and powerful tool that we can use. It's really cool. A couple of other things that we might want to change. I can create folders inside of here, so maybe I want a separate folder for my JavaScript, and maybe I want a separate folder for my CSS. Right, and I'm not going to go ahead and build out this website, but you get the idea. I might want to do that. And then, since this is a website, I might decide that I want all of these resources to be publicly accessible. So every time I'm uploading a file, I'm having to change the file permissions. Okay, and maybe I get that right, maybe I don't, maybe I forget, and that's going to screw things up. Instead, what I want to do is I want to say globally for this Cloud for Developers folder, it's a public website, it's a public-facing website. I want everything to be publicly accessible. So here's kind of a cool trick that you can do, and that is with permissions. Right now it's saying I'm going to allow public access, but then I can also set up this bucket policy. Okay, and what a bucket policy is basically a set of permissions that applies to this policy. Okay, and it's written in JSON. And I could just come down and I could edit this and I could just write the policy inline right here. But more likely I'm going to use this policy generator. And the policy generator is basically going to say, what type of policy are you using? And I'm creating an S3 bucket policy. I'm going to allow everyone. And then I choose which action. So all of these HTTP verbs, all of these different actions that I could access for S3. But the one that I want is get object. Okay, so I want to allow everyone to get an object. And then the Amazon resource name. So if I go back to my S3 console, here's the Amazon resource name. Okay, and it's always going to be Amazon resource name colon AWS colon service. Well, we're using S3, so S3. And then colon colon colon, so 3 colons here. And then the name of the actual bucket. So I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to use that in my policy generator. And you'll notice that I have that Amazon resource name, which takes me to the bucket. But what I want to do is I want to allow a get object on all of the things that are underneath the bucket. So I'm going to end this Amazon resource name with a /*, saying everything underneath that bucket is publicly accessible. I'm going to allow everyone to get all of the objects. So I'm going to add that statement. And I'm going to generate the policy. So here it is. I'm going to go ahead and copy it. And then I should be able to come back over and paste that policy in line. This ID is really supposed to be some kind of meaningful name. And I don't know why I didn't get that in the policy generator. I don't know why I didn't, but I can just go ahead and name it something readable. So I'm going to call it my Spring 2021 Cloud for Developers Public Read Access. And I'm going to save those changes. Okay, so now you'll notice that everything's public. It's saying everything's public. I just made it all public. Here's the bucket policy. I could always come back and edit it. Okay, and I think I might have messed that up. I think I wanted the ID as the statement ID, but we'll see. So let's go ahead and try to add another HTML page. So I'm going to come over and I'm going to create one more HTML page. I'm going to go change the grammar to HTML again, and about us. Which one? This is cool. I go ahead and save it as about.html. And then I want to upload that file again. So I'm going to go ahead and upload. And I'm going to add my file, which is about. And I'm going to go ahead and upload it. And notice I didn't change any of the permissions. But what I want to see is if I go back over to my bucket now, and I'm looking at the properties, and I have a link to my website down below. So I'm just going to go to that website. I have my default page, which is great. I should be able to see my error page. That's great. And then we have that about.html. Okay, and I didn't change the permissions on this individual file. What ended up happening is I had a bucket policy in place saying all of the resources that are inside the bucket are publicly accessible. Okay, so that's kind of the next phase of permissions, and usually what will happen is your permissions will be some combination of IAM and policies, and you'll see these policies actually show up in IAM as well. So this is just kind of our first taste of what AWS policy actually looks like. Okay, so that's the basics of S3 in regards to how we might use S3 for development.